You are never too old to set another goal or to dream a new dream. C.S. Lewis. So to get another great quote um, that I've seen several times, and I think this really kind of does relate again to strength training, because a lot of people they they almost assume that becoming frail as you get older is inevitable, and that it's just something you have to live with and something you have to manage. And they don't realize that there is another option, and they don't know the possibilities out there, and they've almost put it down to age, and they don't think that you once you get to a certain age that you can kind of set these new goals to the strength that will open up. So as a bit of an example, I wanted to use someone that you may well have heard me talk about before, but his name's Phil, and he came to see me at the age of 76. And I'll just bring his video up whilst I do this. So Phil had never done any gym work, never done any regular sport, and he initially came in to see me because of his knee. And we built a bit of initial strength around his knee and then carried on doing some strength training. And this is Phil now deadlifting 75 kilograms. So that bar is 40 on its own. There's two 15-kilogram plates on it, and then you can't quite see, but there's another 2.5 kilogram on each side. So that's 75 in total. Just play that again. And he's now 80 years old, weighing 63 kilograms himself, and he hadn't done this before the age of 76. So real nice example of someone who didn't know that this was possible. They'd never really thought about doing strength training, and by doing it, it's opened up a load more opportunities for him to be able to get back in the garden and do a lot of projects that he started to give up hope that he'd ever be able to do again. So if you are thinking about it and you're wanting to get stronger, or there's certain things you've told yourself that you won't be able to do, then don't give up hope yet. There are things you can do, particularly when it comes to strength training. There might be a few of you looking at this and looking at Phil and just watching him do that makes your back hurt. And there's a bit of a misconception around deadlifting and back pain. And I'm going to cover that on one of the questions that I've prepared ahead of time. So if that's something you're interested in, then do hang on for that. But for now, let's just hide those two. So welcome back. My name's Chris. I'm a physiotherapist, and I'm here to just try and make the gym a less scary place, particularly if you've never done it before. So I run these Q&A sessions to try and give you a chance to ask me any questions that you might have about getting started with strength training, or if you've got started but you're starting to struggle with a particular movement, or just any question. There are no stupid questions. Please do use this opportunity. So to ask a question, you can use the chat feature, or there's a comments underneath the video. They'll flash up to me, and then I can bring those up on screen and we can go through those. If you're not watching this live, but you're watching the recording of this, then please do use the comments, and I will get back to you in a future week's Q&A session to answer that. Whilst you're here, always does me a huge favour if you're able to just click the thumbs up button underneath the video. And if you haven't already, then do make sure you're subscribed to make sure you don't miss any videos that come up in the future. It really does help send good signals to YouTube and Facebook to try and spread this out to more people and see if we can inspire more people to get started. So as always, I have prepared 3 questions that I'm going to cover, and then if there's any questions that come in live, then I will cover those as they come through. So my first question came in reaction to this post that I shared on Facebook. So this came from Dr. Sam Spinelli, who, if you're not already following him on social media, on Instagram and Facebook, I'd highly recommend you do, because he does some great stuff. But his posts were: squats do not wreck your knees. Squats do build strong legs, increase mobility, boost bone density, strengthen tendons, and improve vertical jump. Now, there's a big kind of misconception, and it's kind of understandable when you sort of think about it from one angle, but a lot of people think that if you're doing things like squats or deadlifts or some of these different movement patterns with heavy weight, that heavy weight is surely bad for you and bad for your joints. And they think that people are trying to build muscle strength and do these exercises at the cost of potentially damaging their joints and having to suffer further down the line. And that's just simply not true. There's no evidence really for that. What we're actually finding that a loss of strength is more likely to result in symptomatic or painful arthritis, whereas more strength around the joint tends to mean you might have the same level of arthritis, but it tends to be less painful. He talks about the strengthening tendons there. Stronger muscles around a tendon tend to make that tendon less painful. So again, the strength that you build from these movements is actually protective for joints and protective for tendons rather than something that damages them. So off the back of this post, in the comments, I got someone who asked me, I used to do squats but stopped due to a dodgy hip. Would it be sensible for me to start them again? So the short answer would be yes. I think it'd be very sensible for him to start doing squats again. And again, the reason for that is by building strength around that hip, we're likely to find you're potentially going to get less restriction if it's a tight kind of restrictive feeling around the hip, or if it's going to be less painful if it's a painful hip. So in terms of the restriction side of things, a weak muscle tends to be a stiff muscle. So by building strength, we actually tend to build a bit of lengthen. We sort of build a bit of more mobility around that hip, and we lengthen some of the muscles. And my second question is going to be a bit more related to that, so I'll cover that in a bit more detail in a second. In terms of getting started, if squats in the past have caused some pain or discomfort, then if we go about them the wrong way, then we might worsen that pain and discomfort, which is then counter what we're trying to achieve. So we may need to adapt and modify things to get started before we can then progress on again. So if, for example, if this person used to do squats with his close to his body weight on his back, and he could do a full depth squat, and that's what was bringing on that kind of that sort of dodgy feeling in his hip, or whether that was pain or restriction, if he just goes straight back to that, it's probably going to flare up. So there's a couple of things we can do to start with. So it might be that we just simply reduce the weight. And for a lot of people, if they're coming back after an injury or they're worried about a particular area of their body, I normally suggest if we can get it back to something like 25 to 30% of the weight they would normally use. So if they used to lift 60 kilograms on their back, then I would suggest starting at 15 to 20 and seeing if you went through a full depth squat, does that now feel comfortable? And if so, great, we've got a good starting point to be able to progress from, and somewhere we can always fall back to if we need to. If that still felt quite uncomfortable, then as well as reducing the weight, we might want to think about reducing the depth of the squat. So rather than going right down to kind of thighs parallel, we might put a chair in behind, or a box or a bench. So you're only going down to about half the depth to begin with, and then come back up. And what you normally find is that tends to reduce some of the pain or discomfort. And then you in that shallower squat, you can start to build a bit more strength. And then from there, we can then potentially drop the weight back down again once we've kind of built that strength, and then see if we can then start to go through that deeper range of motion and see if we can start to tolerate that. Because often you find that as you have built strength, we can get deeper into those. The other thing that can be quite useful is the different variations of a squat tend to change how much the hip or the knee has to do. So a squat is a combination of the muscles around the hip and the muscles around the knee working in unison to create that squat movement pattern. And there's just different ratios of how much a hip does versus how much the knee is having to take on at that time. So a back squat tends to use a lot more around the hip, and it might be then if we move to more like a front squat or an overhead squat, that we find that actually the hip is spared for a bit of the load because the knee is doing a bit more of the work. And that might then bring us a bit back underneath the threshold where the hip's comfortable. And then again, we can build strength in that movement pattern And then over time, we then might try and go back to the back squat versus the front squat. So yeah, that gives a few different ideas of how to adapt and modify. But in short to that answer, would it be sensible to start doing squats again with a dodgy hip? Yes, it would do, as long as we can find a good starting point to be able to work from and then progress on. So that it's going to have to look like slightly different from what you might have remembered in the past. But yeah, definitely worth doing again. And if you're really struggling to find that start point, that's where you might want to find a rehab professional, whether it's a sports therapist, physiotherapist, something similar, to try and help you find that right start point. Good, so that was question number 1. Let's just close those. And whilst we've got one related to squats, I've just had the question come in from Kim. So Kim says, hi, thanks for this Q&A. In my second week of your program with the 7 moves, my question is, I just don't know if, I imagine it says I am doing my squats correctly. My back never stays upright like it should. So it doesn't actually matter too much what the back is doing during a squat. Ideally, you'll often people talk about perfect form and optimal form during exercises, and there's a couple of kind of thought process towards that. Some people, it's are they doing it for performance, or are you doing it for the fear of injury or causing pain? So there are certain techniques that are going to make you probably be able to lift more than if you were doing it in a different technique. But the idea that if you're not doing it perfect technique, you're going to go on and get pain, or you might cause yourself a back injury or something like that, it isn't necessarily something we need to worry about, because if you're starting this later in life, you probably find that you've got certain restrictions that will mean you can't quite do things with the perfect optimal technique. And as long as you're starting with that and building up slowly, you're giving your body plenty of time to adapt. Now, if you're doing squats and you're finding you feel like you need to bend forwards as you're doing a squat, that's fine, as long as that your bum is going down, so you're bending your knees. So if you're going down to a chair, what often happens is people stop, and I don't know if you can, if I do it here, is I start coming down and then I stop lowering my bum to the chair, and I just do this to make me feel like I'm getting further. But as long as my bum goes down, it doesn't matter too much whether I'm upright or I'm here and then my bum comes down. As long as I'm getting my bum lower to the, say, a chair behind me, you tend to find that that's where you start to build some strength around the legs. And as the strength gets better, you'll probably find you're able to keep a slightly more upright position. If you're doing the different types of squat there, back squat to a front squat, which is probably a bit more advanced at this point if you've just started doing the program. A front squat tends to mean you have to be a bit further up, so it forces you to be upright, because if I lean forward, the bar is going to fall away from me. Whereas a back squat, I can lean forwards and the bar is just going to rest there. So again, I wouldn't get too hung up on what the back's doing, but if you are still worried about that, Kim, then please do get in touch with me. So you can send me an email. So it's chris@nevertooldtolift.com, and I can help you a bit further with that. Let's bring that out. I'm just going to mention it now whilst Kim mentioned that she's just started the program. So I've got a completely free ebook for anyone who's interested. So you can download this by going to nevertooldtolift.com/start-here. This will help you design a 12-week program, and Kim mentioned those 7 movement patterns there. So it's going to give different exercise variations of each of those 7 movement patterns and help you put them together into a program that's going to work for you and your current ability level, and then help you guide the progressions on from there. So if you're looking for some help in getting started, then do take a look. The link is in the description below. If you'd rather have a physical copy rather than reading off a screen, then there is a paperback that's available on Amazon. So if you just search Never Too Old to Lift on Amazon, you'll find that there. Good. So next question that I had come through via email. So again, if anyone's watching and they don't want to ask kind of publicly, then you can just send me an email. So it's chris@nevertooldtolift.com. And then again, I'll just bring it up anonymously like this. So how important is stretching after strength training? Now, a lot of it depends on why you are strength training and why you are stretching and what you're trying to achieve from stretching. So there's a lot of people that have been told in the past, and it's just been a bit of a common misconception, that people who stretch more are less likely to pick up an injury than people who don't stretch. And unfortunately, there isn't much evidence to back that up. There's also a lot of people say that people who stretch more will recover more quickly and their body will repair more quickly than people who don't stretch. And again, there isn't much evidence to support that. What stretching can do is it can reduce some of the soreness you might get in the day or two after training. If it's something that is something you tend to suffer with is soreness afterwards, and stretching can be really useful because it's just going to mean the next few days are going to be more comfortable for you. There's also a bit of a myth that if you stretch, you're going to increase your flexibility in the long term. In the short term, you tend to feel a bit more flexible, but the long term, you tend to find it feels a bit tighter again. And what we're actually finding is if you strengthen your muscles, you create just as much length in the muscles whilst at the same time building strength. So there's a process called, and I always pronounce it slightly wrong, but it's sarcomerogenesis. That is the process that particularly when you're doing eccentric training, so say with a bicep curl, as I lift up, my muscles are shortening to create that length, but on the way down, they're having to lengthen at the same time they're trying to contract to control that down. So we call that lowering phase of the motion the eccentric phase. If you can work slowly through that eccentric phase of the motion, you tend to find you get just as much length created in the muscles as a regular stretching program. So if you've only got time to do one thing and focus on one thing, I would always go for the strengthening phase. If you find that you feel good after stretching, it feels something that you like to do, then by all means add stretching in. I still do it, but I do it because I like the feeling of it after a workout, not because I'm under the impression that I'm not going to get injured if I do it or I'm going to recover quicker. It's just something that I've always done, quite like the feeling of, and I've got the time to do it. I'm not doing it at the expense of doing the strengthening work. Some people have incorporated it into their warm-ups, which can be done. I think I talked about warm-ups last week, so if you've not watched last week's yet, it's well worth having a look at that. But basically, when you're looking at a warm-up, you're trying to warm up the muscles you're about to use in your workout ahead of strengthening. So if you're going to go into heavy squats, it's worth doing some body weight squats, and then it's worth then maybe doing a few of those with half the amount of weight you're planning on using, and then you can go into your working weight and do your sets there. Whereas just going through some stretches ahead of doing the squats isn't going to prepare your body for the heavy weight you're about to use in that movement pattern. So you can incorporate them into a warm-up, but there wouldn't be my main focus. So I hope that helps with that. As a reminder, just like Kim did, if anyone else is watching live and you want to ask me any questions, then do use the chat in YouTube or the comments in Facebook, and I'm happy to answer any questions you've got there. And the last question that I have prepared is, I'm worried about deadlifting due to existing back pain. Do you have any advice? So this is something I have covered in one of the previous Q&A sessions, but it's a question that I regularly get. So I wanted to go over that again, and this kind of ties in a little bit with what I've already talked about with after doing squats with the hip and any knee pain is, once again, there's a common misconception that if you deadlift, it's bad for your back and it's bad for your joints and you're going to cause yourself a slip disc. So people kind of worry about deadlifting because they've often experienced some form of back pain if they've tried it, if they've not done it in the quite right way, or they've added too much weight too quickly. And what they do is they leave it out, and they leave out any other form of hip hinge variation. So a deadlift is a form of hip hinge. The knees aren't really flexing too much. It's much more of a movement from the hip. And that's how it differs from a squat, and which is why it's a different movement pattern there. If you leave that hip hinge exercise out, you're then missing one of the kind of the most common movement patterns you do on a daily basis. And your back starts to lose strength and it loses tolerance to that movement pattern. And that increases the chance that if you then go out in the garden, you try and lift a flower pot to move it, your back isn't prepared for that. And you might just tweak something and cause a bit of a reaction and cause a bit of pain. Whereas if you practiced it in the gym, your back would have been prepared for it and you probably wouldn't have had the same issue. However, if you've, just like the person who tried to do the squats and it caused them hip pain, if you've been doing deadlifting and it caused you back pain, then we need to adapt that in the early stages and try and find that kind of fallback, that level that you can start on, that you can always fall back to if you have a reaction, and then progress again from there. So in the same way the squats, some common things you can do is you can initially reduce the weight of what you think you should be doing. So if you used to squat, deadlift with, let's go 60 kilograms again, let's start at 15 to 20 kilograms. Now, does that cause a reaction? If it's no, great. Let's sort of work at 15 to 20 kilograms for a little bit. And over a few weeks, we gradually add a little bit of weight, then a little bit more weight, and just making sure we're comfortable with that. And then what you'll find is you'll probably be able to get to the 60 kilograms and beyond if you've taken it slowly enough. If 15 to 20 kilograms is still causing you a bit of a twinge and discomfort in the back, then again, we can reduce the depth. So with a deadlift, what we do, we need to raise the bar up to work through that shallow range of motion. So there are things we can do called rack pulls. So you might have the bar rested on the hooks of a squat rack, or some have the kind of longer hooks called sort of safety bars that you can rest it on. And then you're starting from a much shallower range of motion. You might only go through half that range of motion. Another option is the bar, and you've got the weight plates on either end. You can rest those weight plates on something that's raised up. So some people even put other weight plates laid flat on the floor underneath them, and that raises them up. Some people put them on steps, but just working through a shallow range of motion normally means it kind of brings you back underneath the threshold where the deadlift is now comfortable. And in that shallow range of motion, we can really build the strength back, build the weight up to build the strength in the shallow range of motion, which then allows you to then start exploring deeper ranges of motion after a few months of doing it. If that still isn't comfortable, you're not confident with the deadlift type motion, there are other forms of hip hinge exercise. So it doesn't have to be a deadlift. We can get going with a different form of hip hinge. So the most simple form is a bridge. So where you lay on your back with your knees bent and your feet flat on the floor, and you lift your bum up into the air. That is another form of hip hinge. And you can actually start to rest weights on your waist, so that when you lift your bum in the air, you're not just lifting the weight of your kind of bum and torso, you're lifting the weight that's resting on top of those. To progress that, you can then work into a hip thruster. So rather than being on the floor, you're resting your back on a bench or a kind of a plyo box, a raised surface, and that way you're able to sink further into the movement and then lift back up again. Again, a few weeks ago I did a bit more of a section on hip thrusters, so do go back and watch that if you need to kind of be able to visualize what a hip thruster is. But yeah, there's various ways that you can build strength in that movement pattern, just in different positions. And then once you've built that strength, you can go back into the deadlifting, and you should find that the back pain starts to reduce, and it isn't a problem, and then you just feel stronger, more robust, more resilient, and you trust your back more in everyday life by having done deadlifts. And it's a really empowering movement pattern to be able to do. You saw Phil earlier there doing deadlifts with 75 kilograms at the start of the video, and he never thought he'd ever be able to lift that kind of weight. Like the first time I put a 10 kilo kettlebell in front of him, he thought I was crazy. And then to go on and now lift 75 kilograms for multiple repetitions, he feels so confident outside the gym and in the garden and taking on projects that he kind of ruled out a long time ago. So there's something really kind of psychologically powerful about being able to deadlift more than your body weight. Again, not something you'd want to rush straight into, but something that's well worth thinking about progressing from there. Good, but if you're struggling to find a start point and your back is something you are worried about and it's limiting you from even starting deadlifts or squats or any other training, that again, that's where it's worth having a look into physiotherapist, rehab professional, sports therapist to help you find the start point, and then you'll be able to progress it from there. Good, so that was all the questions that I'd come prepared with. If you are watching this live, this is your final chance to ask me any other questions that you might have about strength training, getting started, etc. Whilst you might be just typing any questions or thinking about that, I just wanted to remind you again, if you are looking to get started with strength training and you just want a little bit of support, then I've got the Never Taught to Lift ebook that you can download for free. Just go to that link or the links in the description, and that will help you kind of put together a program that's going to work for you. A reminder, you can find that on Amazon, and it's Never Taught to Lift, and just search that on Amazon and you'll find that come up. And you also might be interested in, there's the online course that it's very similar content to the ebook, but it's put together in sort of small video formats, a lot more interactive, and you'll get, as part of it, the option to add on a weekly group Zoom calls with myself where you can kind of go through any sticking points that you might have. So if you feel like the ebook's not going to be enough for you and you want more support and a bit more of an interactive way of going through all that, then do take a look. It's nevertaught2lift.com/course. So just have a look. I don't think there's any more questions coming through. So if you are watching this afterwards, do use the comments to ask me any more questions, or if you want to email me with any questions, it's chris@nevertaught2lift.com. I'll be back here 12 o'clock next Wednesday for the next session and take it from there. So have a great week. Thanks.